Okay, so in lesson 7, we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle, the heart, and circulation through the heart and the end system. I'm going to start off by saying the diagram on the front page is basically just labels all over the heart. So I'm not going to read through all of these labels. What I will explain to you, though, is just a couple of them that we're not really going to refer too often to. First thing I want to just note is that I'm using colors here very intentionally. So anywhere where there is a blue arrow, that is showing deoxygenated blood flow and the direction. So the direction is very, very important here. The red is going to be oxygenated blood flow. So basically through this lesson, I'm going to be walking you through all of the different labels that are on here. What I might just ask you to do is sort of write those labels down on your own, and you'll see that throughout the lesson, I will refer to all of these different areas. So you're welcome to write that down sort of on your own. I just want to mention that how we actually describe this heart is a 4-chamber heart connected to 2 circuits. And the 2 circuits that I'm talking about, and I referenced them in lesson 5 as well, is called the pulmonary circuit, which is moving things between the heart and lungs, and the systemic circuit, which is moving things between the heart and the rest of the body systems. So that's the 2 systems that we're really working for towards here. There's also some things not actually shown here because this picture of the heart is essentially a cross section. So I've taken the heart and I've cut it so that we can see inside to all the chambers. So not shown in here is the pericardium, which is a very thin layer of tissue around the heart. Basically, it's to prevent the heart rubbing against any other organs, specifically the lungs and the rib cage, which are sort of right on top of the heart and covering it. You don't want to have lots of friction between those because friction eventually causes damage. So the pericardium layer is a super thin layer, almost like a really thin skin, which has much less friction. So as they rub against each other, as we move, or as the heart's beating, or as the lungs are inflating, we're not causing any damage to either of those. We also have coronary blood vessels. So they would essentially be on top of the heart as well. So if this is the heart, you have all these vessels on top of it, which are essentially feeding the heart muscle. So just like every other cell of our body, the heart needs to have access to constant supply of oxygen and glucose. So those coronary blood vessels that are on top of the heart are making sure that the heart is getting what it needs. All of this internal flow, it does not actually feed the heart. This is simply acting as a pump. So externally, it has all these other blood vessels supplying it, just making sure that it's getting what it needs. Also the chordae tendineae. So this particular diagram doesn't show it because it would be very, very complicated. But you essentially have these tissues which act almost as like rubber bands, which are keeping each of these chambers from collapsing in on itself. So when a chamber is empty, it's not going to just deflate like a deflated balloon. It has these like little supports within it, which are called the chordae tendineae, which are actually helping to keep all of those different chambers open. So I'm not going to read out all the names here because I think it's not that useful. You're going to see here that I've labeled like an overall direction of blood flow. So I'm going to actually use the diagram to explain this. You're going to see me use short forms like this quite often. So I'm just going to explain to you what all that is. So the first thing about this that I want to mention is you might be looking at it and thinking, oh, she's forgotten which way is left and right. No, in fact, when we look at it, we're acting as if we're looking at it within a person. So if you're looking at me, my right side is actually on your left. Okay, so that's why the right and left are the orientation that they are. It's as if you're looking at this heart in a person that you're looking at or in a patient that you're looking at. So I'm going to start the idea of blood flow coming from the tissues. So blood has just been at the tissues. It has given its oxygen and accepted carbon dioxide. So when it enters the heart on the right side with these blue arrows through both the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, it enters as deoxygenated blood. And the first chamber that it enters into is right here called the right atrium. Right atrium is sort of like a holding chamber. And essentially what happens is that as this fills up with blood, it's going to push down on this valve, this AV valve. The long version of this is called an atrioventricular valve. And so it puts pressure on this AV valve until there's so much blood in there that it's actually going to push through. Okay. And then you end up down here in the right ventricle. Right ventricle, I always remember they're shaped as a V, right? You have a right and a left ventricle. So it's going to have quite a bit of myogenic muscle around it. So if you look at this thick wall along the bottom, you see my label of myogenic or cardiac muscle. That is a very muscular area. So you're going to see that the right ventricle has some of that. It's a thin sort of muscle layer. The left ventricle is a way thicker muscle, and I'll describe why in a few minutes. So from the right ventricle, you're going to have a contraction, and that's going to send this deoxygenated blood up through the right pulmonary and left pulmonary artery. And their ultimate goal and where they're headed towards is then the left and the right lung. And you might know this from grade 10, but in the lungs, you're going to have oxygenation. Okay, so those blood cells are going to give up their CO2 and they're going to absorb or take in oxygen. So that happens at the level of the lungs themselves. We're going to talk about that in lesson number 8, actually. So we're going to see the lung part of that happening. But from the lungs, that oxygenated blood is going to return to the heart. So that is where you see right pulmonary vein and left pulmonary vein. Here I'll just mention the difference between artery and vein here. So here, the artery has deoxygenated blood because, as I said in lesson 6, the arteries always take blood away from the heart. So even though it's deoxygenated blood here going to the lungs, we still call it an artery. Here we have veins carrying oxygenated blood, which is unlike the rest of the system. But same idea is that anytime a vessel moves blood to the heart, we call it a vein. So that's the reason this is right and left pulmonary vein. So that's why it's like that. So these are going to enter into the left atrium. Very similar thing happens. The blood eventually puts enough weight down on this AV valve, this atrioventricular valve, that eventually pushes through into this left ventricle. Now, at this point, and we're going to talk about this in later steps, the myogenic muscle is controlled by a whole set of nerves within the heart. And we're going to see that this ventricle is going to contract because it's a really thick muscle. We can see that it has a lot of power behind it. And that contraction is going to push open this little valve here and essentially push open into this aorta area. So I mentioned here we often call this a semilunar valve, and you can see that there's semilunar valve on either side. And so into the aorta, this area is called the aortic arch. Okay, I mentioned in lesson 6, aorta is the largest of the arteries in our bodies, and that's going to branch off into all of the systemic arteries. So whether they go up or down, I know here they're pointing upward, but it goes all around the body, all to the systems. Now, I want to just mention briefly, and we talked about this also in lesson 6. The purpose of valves also within the heart is to prevent things from flowing backwards. So looking at the right ventricle just as an example, you can see that the orientation of the valves is such that if the blood were to push back onto this AV valve, it would not be able to open that valve. Okay, it's like a closed gate. Having said that, also the semilunar valves, the same thing. The reason they're in that direction is to prevent the backflow from happening. So a little bit more about that afterward. We're going to move into the cardiac cycle. So what I'm talking about is the flow. As the heart is beating, what's happening within the heart. So this is happening within one heartbeat. That's the cardiac cycle. There are 2 phases, diastole and systole. And this might sound familiar from lesson 6, diastolic pressure and systolic pressure. So the diastole is the period of time when the ventricles relax, and this allows them to fill up with blood that has been stored previously in the atria. Systole is the period when the ventricles contract, that really strong, forceful contraction that pushes the blood out of the heart and into the arteries. Again, each of these time periods or each of these phases, so to speak, can be measured as the diastolic versus the systolic pressure, which we were talking about previously. So down here, this little graph is basically showing those two periods of time versus pressure. And you'll notice that pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. That's just the pressure units that we use for this particular measurement. So you're going to see that the diastolic is a really low pressure, right? That's when the ventricles are not contracting, so that makes sense. Then suddenly the ventricles start to contract, and we see the systole actually beginning, this systole phase. And here we're going to have a really high pressure, okay? So I go through these steps, and you'll notice that they match up here with 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, up to 5, and then it will repeat again for the next heartbeat, okay? So this is all happening within one heartbeat. These diagrams down here also refer to the same graph, which is essentially showing what is the blood actually, where is it moving to in each of these different 5 parts. So part 1, we have the atria relaxed and actually filling up with blood. So that's coming in a deoxygenated blood from the tissues, and the left atrium with oxygenated blood from the lungs and from the pulmonary circuit. The full atria, as I mentioned, they're going to put pressure and weight on the AV valves and cause the ventricles then to fill with blood. Now, before moving on to the ventricle contraction, we actually do have some myogenic muscle around the atria. They're going to contract and basically force that little remaining blood that's in there into the ventricles. From that point, the ventricles will begin their contraction. They will shut those AV valves, as I mentioned, and we hear that actually as a heart sound. So I'm going to mention that really soon. These semilunar valves remain shut until the end of the heartbeat now. Now, in step 5, you're going to have the full contraction of the ventricles, the right ventricle pushing deoxygenated blood to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries, left ventricle pushing oxygenated blood to the body tissues through the aorta. I mentioned previously on the diagram on the front, the aorta will lead to the systemic arteries and ultimately to those capillary networks that we mentioned in lesson 6 as well. So I was mentioning the sound of the heart. So those valves snapping shut, we hear that as a heartbeat, okay? Mentioning, as I did before, the valves shutting is preventing some backflow. So if you think of the heartbeat, it has sort of two sounds. One is almost a softer sound and one is a much louder sound. So the first one, which is often called lub, occurs when the atrioventricular valves shut as the ventricles begin to contract. So again, we start pushing blood against the valves, and that causes them to snap shut. So much so that we can actually hear that with the scopes. Okay. The second sound, which is much louder, this is when the ventricles relax and the semilunar valves snap shut. So that was the aortic and pulmonary valve. So that sound is much louder because you have a much forceful flow of blood through there, and so therefore the force against those valves is much stronger. So again, if we listen with a stethoscope, we should be able to hear those two distinct sounds. Now, if we don't hear those sounds, this could be caused by what's called the heart murmur. And what that really is the valves not snapping shut completely. And this is not life-threatening. However, it does make things a little bit less efficient. And depending on the severity of that heart murmur, the person may have to, for example, avoid certain activities. Like they might not be allowed to do super high cardio activities and things like that. So we call that a heart murmur because the sounds that we hear there are not distinct, okay? What I'll ask you to do, and I've posted it in the summer school daily schedule, is to actually listen to the sounds of the heartbeat in the video that I've posted there, and sort of outlines what is happening in the heart at each of those times, okay? So I had mentioned earlier, which is how do we regulate the heartbeat? The heart is actually on its totally own distinct system for regulation. So most of our body, in fact, everywhere else but the heart, is controlled by the brain. Or by some system that leads back to the brain. The heart actually can be controlled by the brain, but it also has its own internal system. So just in case there is a disconnect between brain and heart, the heart should be able to continue to still keep beating. Okay. So I've mentioned here in some situations our brain does take over the heart as well. So an example of that would be if you were doing like public speaking and you were really nervous. Well, your brain is the one thinking about being nervous. Your heart is then told to increase the beating. Um, Also, exercise as well. The brain essentially says, oh, wow, you're using a lot more oxygen. You need to circulate more blood around to the muscles. And so it will initiate an increase in the heartbeat as well. We have a couple of structures that I couldn't show in the other diagram because there was a lot going on. The first is the sinoatrial node up in the top corner of the right atrium. And the sinoatrial or SA node initiates the electrical signal to begin a heartbeat. And it's really responsible for maintaining a consistent rhythm in the heart. And what I want you to notice on my diagram, I've kind of put like little arrows here. So it starts at the sinoatrial node. It sends a little electrical impulse, a little signal to the AV node, which is the atrioventricular node. And you can see it's sort of at the top of the right ventricle, okay? This is a bundle of nerves that then sends that signal on to the next part, which are the Purkinje fibers. So we have these three structures which are communicating via electrical nerve impulses, sending signals between one to the next. The Purkinje fibers is this blue stuff at the bottom, where I've labeled it around the ventricles, looking like V's. These conduct the signal, essentially making the ventricles contract. And this is a very special and specific type of muscle called a myogenic or a cardiac muscle. It is not found anywhere else in our bodies. It's only in the heart. And the reason why this is that these Purkinje fibers are creating a really coordinated beat, okay? They're essentially making sure that all the muscles in that ventricle are beating in the same rhythm, okay? That type of consistency is really not needed elsewhere in the body, but here we do need it because we need to make sure that all of the heart is working together. So, excuse me, that brings us to talk about how we analyze the heartbeat. So as I was saying, that is electrical signals being sent out, which is controlling ultimately the beating of the heart. So since the heartbeat is electrically stimulated, it can be measured as well using something called an electrocardiogram or an ECG. So ECG, they will put all these electrodes on you and they will essentially be measuring the heartbeat, okay? This graph over here, we call it an electrocardiograph. It's essentially showing energy over time. So it's measuring that impulse that's happening throughout the heart. So we're not going to practice analyzing this. We don't really need it for our purposes. But what a doctor is looking for is the strength and the frequency. So how quickly it's happening, as well as the strength of these impulses. So if we see that these impulses are not as high as we'd like, or the pace is very inconsistent, the person might be treated with an electronic pacemaker. So a little pacemaker that's usually now installed in them, very, very small now, which sends that little electrical signal, keeping the heart beating in a consistent way. So why someone might need that and why this graph might be off for some people. It's possible that throughout a heart attack, for example, there's been some damage to some of these tissues that I'm talking about up here. So if there has been a heart attack or some type of blockage that's damaged the heart in any sort of way, these signals might not be actually getting between those three structures, or they're getting there, but the heart is not responding to them anymore. Those are examples where you definitely want to put the pacemaker in. So I put a couple homework questions here. It's really similar to what we talked about in this lesson. I would recommend trying those out just to see that you really understood what we did in here.